Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. I'm a big fan of looking at alternative historical questions. What if the Nazis had won World War II? That's the most common one, but other ones like, what if the Roman Empire hadn't fallen in the West? What if somebody else had discovered the New World before Europe? China, the most likely candidate, but the Ottoman Empire could have been in the running. They had a good navy too. What if Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, had never been born? How would that have affected Middle Eastern history? Those are a number of alternate history questions, and I've covered things like these in the podcast. Another one that's super common, it's probably the second most common behind what if Nazi Germany had won World War II, is what if the Confederacy had won the Civil War? Listener Tom White posed this question to me to see how things would have turned out if the Confederacy had won and been able to maintain their independence. That opens up a whole bunch of questions, and there's no right answer to this because it didn't happen. And we could probably guess what things would look like in 1866 and the 1860s and 1870s. But once this alternate timeline drifts further and further away from the real timeline, then we're getting well into the realm of speculation. So, hey, let's speculate. Who knows what it could have looked like? We have examples today of a unified nation that, due to political events, split into two different nations, like East and West Germany, that stood against each other. What would the standoff be like? Would it be like East and Western Germany, where there's a wall between the two? Would it be like North and South Korea, where there's an armistice, there's never really peace established? Or would it be like North and South Dakota? There was a very peaceful split. There's no problem between the two, and they really have no cultural distinction from one another, even though they're administered differently. What would have happened? Before we get into this question, I always like to zoom out and look at a bigger question, and first of all, address some of the controversies around this issue. One of the big questions is, could the Confederacy have won the Civil War? Some argue that it was completely impossible. Structurally, there's simply no way that the South could have won, so entertaining this is as useless as entertaining the question of what if the dinosaurs had survived. Maybe it could have happened, but in the world we live in, there was simply no chance. So first, I'll address that question of could the South have won the Civil War, for example, and I'll spend a lot of time on that because that's something that I think people argue a lot. Then I'm going to look at different theories of what if the South had won. Many people have speculated on this, including Winston Churchill himself, who was very interested in Civil War history. Others who think that things wouldn't have turned out so bad, and then yet others who believe that human history would have gone far worse, and the voices of racial apartheid would have been much louder, and for all the domestic problems that we have today and the inequalities would have been exacerbated tremendously if the Confederacy had survived. So, let's get into part one now. Could the South have won the Civil War? One myth is that the South did the best it could with the resources it had, but overall it never had a chance to win the Civil War. Outside of an alien invasion, there was simply too much of a structural disadvantage. The North had, of course, superior industrial strength and an almost 4-to-1 manpower advantage, which would make it unbeatable. This myth comes from quotes like Robert E. Lee, who said to his troops at Appomattox, whom he consoled with this message, "After 4 years of arduous service, marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources." And a rebel soldier repeated this theme. "They never whipped us, sir, unless they were 4-to-1. If we had anything like a fair chance, or less disparity of numbers, we should have won our cause and established our independence." Civil War historian Richard Current, a century later, echoed Lee's assessment, and he said, "Surely, in view of the disparity in resources, it would have taken a miracle, a direct intervention of the Lord on the other side, to enable the South to win. As usual, God was on the side of the heaviest battalions." Alan Nolan summarized the theory like this, that the Confederates had not really been defeated. They had been overwhelmed by massive Northern manpower and material. Furthermore, the South's loss was said to be inevitable from the beginning. The fact of loss was somehow mitigated in the myth because it was said that winning had been impossible. If the Confederacy could not have won, it somehow did not lose. Southerners shall be foot, put it in Ken Burns' 1990 documentary, The Civil War, the North fought the war with one hand behind its back. The North could have brought the other arm out from behind its back. I don't think the South ever had a chance of winning the war. But some think that the South could have won the Civil War if things had gone differently. James McPherson noted, there was nothing inevitable about Northern victory in the Civil War. After the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, there was an 11-state Confederacy, a nation-state, that asserted its independence. It also drew strength from volunteers from non-seceding slave states of Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware. All the Confederacy needed was a stalemate. All it had to do was exhaust the morale of the North, much like the new United States had done against Britain in the Revolutionary War. The burden was on the North to defeat the Confederacy, to fight away from their homeland, and compel the return of 11 wayward states to the Union. McPherson wrote, the South could win the war by not losing, but the North could win only by winning. The South was outnumbered and lacked the industrial resources of the North, but the Confederacy wasn't without advantages of its own. First, it was large, 750,000 square miles that would have to be held that the Federals would have to invade and conquer. So space was in favor of the South, even if the enemy overran its borders. The principal cities of the South were few in number, they were far removed from the hostile bases, and important railroad junctions were secure from sudden attack. And with this massive amount of space and low infrastructure that made it hard for the South to transport supplies, also made it hard for the North to keep up supply lines. And Southern troops had to cover shorter distances than the invaders, and could do so over a complex of well-placed railroads. An analysis of the American Civil War, published in the Times of London, recognized the Confederates' huge strategic advantage. It said, no war of independence ever terminated unsuccessfully except where the disparity of force was far greater than it is in this case. Just as England during the American Revolution had to give up conquering the colonies, so the North will have to give up conquering the South. The Confederate Secretary of War, George Randolph, shared this optimism about the South's prospects early in the war. There is no instance in history of a people as numerous as we are inhabiting a country so extensive as ours being subjected, if true, to themselves. And other Southerners agreed. James Barber, a delegate to the Virginia Secession Convention, quoted Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens' assessment of Southern strength when the Confederacy consisted of only 7 states. With such an area of territory, with such an amount of population, with a climate and soil unsurpassed of any on the face of the earth, with such resources already at our command, with productions which control the commerce of the world, who could entertain any apprehensions as to our success, whether others join us or not? Barber himself voiced the hope that England and France, although they found slavery distasteful, would deal and make money out of the most lucrative customer on the face of the globe. And England and France happily traded with other slave states, with Brazil, countries in South America. After the war, various Confederate generals expressed their views that the war had been winnable. In 1874, Joseph Johnston insisted that the South had not been guilty of the high crime of undertaking a war without the means of waging it successfully. Pierre G.T. Beauregard added, no people ever warred for independence without more relative advantages than the Confederates. E. Porter Alexander's retrospective assessment was more modest than Beauregard's, but he too thought the South could have won. When the South entered upon war, with power so immensely her superior in men and money, and all the wealth of modern resources and machinery and transportation appliances by land and sea, she could entertain but one single hope of final success. That was that the desperation of her resistance would finally exact from her adversary such a price in blood and treasure as to exhaust the enthusiasm of its population for the objects of the war. We could not hope to conquer her. Our one chance was to wear her out. So if you really stop and think about it, if the war was truly unwinnable, you would have to wonder why there was so much Southern popular support for the war effort if all the masses thought they were going to engage in a Quixotic affair. At least from the ground and from higher up and from the strategic level of the Confederacy, it seemed perfectly reasonable that the South could win. And much of Europe expected, and maybe some desired, a Confederate victory. The downfall of the American Colossus, which the Times wrote an opinion, would be good riddance of a nightmare. Excepting a few gentlemen of Republican tendencies, we all expect, we nearly all wish, success to the Confederate cause. The Earl of Shrewsbury joined in, and he cheerfully predicted, the dissolution of the Union is inevitable, and that men before me will live to see an aristocracy established in America. As late as 1863, Russia's minister to the United States declared, the Republican form of government, so much talked about by the Europeans and so much praised by the Americans, is breaking down. What can be expected from a country where men of humble origin are elevated to the highest positions? A Southern victory wasn't out of the question. It had only been 80 years since the supposedly inferior American revolutionaries were able to defeat the mighty British Army, and less than 50 years since the outgunned Russians had repelled and destroyed the invading army of Napoleon. John Cook identified 4 specific Confederate advantages: the psychological edge of fighting for independence and to protect their homes and way of life, interior lines and geography, including rivers, mountains, and swamps that were the equivalent of successive lines of fortification, 3, higher per capita production of corn, livestock, and other necessities of life, and 4, cotton, which, properly utilized, could provide economic and diplomatic benefits. But by declining to use slaves as soldiers, the heavily outnumbered Confederacy failed to exploit its available manpower. Some Southerners were counting on the manpower their slaves could provide in the war effort. In 1861, for example, Jeremiah Morton, a pro-secession delegate to Virginia's convention, explained that if the tug of war ever comes, I would rather have the 4 millions of slaves and the 8 millions of freemen than to have 16 millions of free men and no slaves. Give us 4 millions of slaves under the management and discipline of Southern planters and Southern men, and they will give you more sinews of war than 10 millions of free men agitated with the cares of families and the harassments of military duties. Morton didn't see that slaves, underutilized by the Confederacy, would become Union assets, and that rebel soldiers, facing the invading Union armies, would soon enough concern themselves with the care of their families. The use of black soldiers by the Confederacy could have been effective. Bruce Levine wrote, early in the war, when Lincoln was still defining the Union cause narrowly, for reunion alone and not for emancipation, and when Union officers were still refusing sanctuary to runaway slaves, significant numbers of such slaves might have accepted an offer of emancipation in exchange for performing Confederate military service. But instead of that, the rebels ignored the encouraging precedents of black soldiers in the American Revolution over George Washington's initial objections and the War of 1812 and allowed their support of slavery and white supremacy to rule out this option. The war was winnable if Southern resources were husbanded carefully. But Robert E. Lee's strategy and tactics wasted manpower due to his aggressiveness. His losses at Mechanicsville, Malvern Hill, Antietam, and Gettysburg, and his victories, some would say Pyrrhic victories, for how many lives he lost at Gaines Mill, Second Bull Run, and Chancellorsville, which were all in 1862 and 1863, made it possible for Grant and Sherman's successful campaigns against Richmond and Atlanta in 1864, and to produce a sense of inevitability of Confederate defeat that contributed to Lincoln's re-election. In the book Why the South Lost the Civil War, 4 historians analyze the South's defensive advantages. The Confederate Army suffered no crippling deficiency in weapons or supplies. The principal handicap would have been numerical inferiority, but to offset this lack, Confederates fought the first major war in which both sides armed themselves with rifles and had the advantage of a temporary but very significant surge in the power of the tactical defensive. In addition, the problem of supply in a very large but thinly settled region was a powerful aid to the strategic defensive. Other things being equal, Confederate military leadership were confident that the Union didn't display Napoleonic genius. The tactical and strategic power of the defensive could offset the Northern superiority. In short, the task of the North was literally gigantic. It was a task of organizing and harnessing its superior resources and committing them to warfare on a financial scale that was historically unprecedented. Inertia was on the South side and would have been fatal to the North. The North had the necessity to conquer. The South could have won simply by not being conquered. It didn't have to occupy a foot of ground outside